Welcome to Series 3 of the Herbal Spot, where we engage our stakeholders, professionals and scientists, researchers who have a vested interest in the field of conservation of plant biodiversity to share experiences and enlighten us as we look towards making the most of our plant biodiversity, both here in the Caribbean and across the globe. Today we have our first guest for the series, who joins us with a vast experience in community conservation, Dr. Teri Allendorf. Welcome, Teri.
Thank you, Sonia. I'm happy to be here.
Great. It was my good fortune to meet you at the conference held by the Society for Ethnobotany and Society for Ethnobiology, and I could not pass up the opportunity to have you share your vast knowledge with us as we have a brief chat on the Herbal Spot. So I'm going to read a bit of your bio. Then we are looking forward to hearing about your global experiences. Dr. Teri Allendorf is the Executive Director of Community Conservation located in Wisconsin, with projects around the world, including Peru, Myanmar, Nepal, Madagascar, Thailand, and Cameroon. She is an honorary fellow in the Department of Forest and Wildlife Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Teri has worked on issues of local communities and conservation since 1994 and brings her vast academic and practical experience into the field of conservation biology. She was a Peace Corps volunteer in Nepal, a fellow with USAID's biodiversity team, and a Fulbright senior specialist. With her vast knowledge and experience, she is, of course, published in many scientific articles, and importantly, she is involved in curriculum development, as we need our younger individuals to take up the mantle and take us into the future. Thank you again, Teri. It's interesting to see that you have also been working in Guyana.
Yes, just one visit, but yes, I have had a chance to visit many different places around the world through my work with USAID and in addition to the projects that I've been working on with community conservation.
Fantastic. I'll ask you a little bit about that one visit, but generally, could you share with us what led you to the field of biodiversity conservation?
I got a PhD in conservation biology back in the 1990s when the projects were the programs for conservation biology were fairly new, and I went into it thinking I wanted to do more ecology. More hardcore natural sciences to conserve biodiversity. But after my Peace Corps experiences and a few classes in conservation biology, I realized, as I think most of us have by this point, that humans are the key piece to all of that. And so to conserve biodiversity, we have to be thinking about people. And the other thing I learned through my Peace Corps experience that really motivates and inspires me to this day is just the joy that there are people in every community everywhere in the world that take so much pride and joy in their local biodiversity. Mm-hmm. But so often they have very few opportunities to learn about their biodiversity, in terms of the larger context and the access to knowledge that we all have. Right. Or to conserve it. They don't have the capacity or the institutions supported by their local governments or their national governments. And I was lucky to have been Peace Corps in Nepal, which began their community forestry program. And it really took off in the early 90s when I was there. So I got to hear and experience the excitement that these local people had where I lived for 2 years in their forests, and the fact that they would get to manage it from that, that time forward. So that's how I got into thinking about humans and biodiversity and the importance of communities.
Yeah, I share your philosophy because, as you said, me personally, my experience is that I wanted to be a top chemical researcher. I use the word top because we always have these ideals. And I did do my PhD looking at natural products from one of the very important species that we have on island. And as you said, when you begin to delve deeper, the human component always comes to the fore. And I found myself then searching, for that connection, sort of a conduit between my love for chemistry and my, you know, improved appreciation of the fact that we have to look at that human component. And that led me to the Society for Ethnobotany, as it is today, previously Society for Economic Botany. And the sensitivity that they expressed in their work did indeed offer me that conduit. And I am now firmly planted in looking at that interrelationship. So I fully understand. So I know that you have a wide global experience. So could you tell us a bit about the scope and importance of your work, especially the positioning of your organization?
Yeah, so community conservation has been around since the 1980s, and we've had projects in over 15 countries, more than nearly 30 projects, probably over 30 projects at this point with different communities and in different places. And I was so gratified actually at the meeting when I went to your presentation. This is how we first connected, right? Is you had a slide from a paper by our founder, Rob Horwich, who published a lot on the process of community conservation.
Yeah.
And he was basically a natural scientist who, like us, also said, wait a minute, we can't do this without communities. And so to see you using the process is amazing. And that's sort of the goal of our organization, right? Is we do support these on the ground field projects, usually through local partners in different countries, so that we are directly supporting communities, which is a really critical piece of our work. But we also, after this long, really want to scale up those lessons and share them with more people and provide support to more people who want to use those methods or integrate them into what they're doing. Because, we've known communities and people are important for a long time, but it can still be really hard for people to integrate it into what they're doing, whether we're talking the big organizations like WWF or, smaller ones who are focused on a particular species like rhinos or elephants, right? How to actually incorporate communities can be hard. And I think, like you said, it really takes people who've experienced the excitement in a community to do conservation to really understand what we mean by community conservation, right? Because often people think of it as more of a top down, we need to raise people's awareness. We have to convince them of something, that they need to conserve biodiversity. And then we have to provide livelihood benefits so that they'll be motivated. And, our experience in the field with community conservation, our projects, is that communities want support to conserve their biodiversity. And they recognize that livelihoods is either a separate piece or a piece that sort of has to come later after you get, your ducks in a row in terms of preserving your environment and governance and management and capacity to do conservation, right? And then the rest follows. Your healthful, a healthy environment means that your community is healthier, right? And you have more natural resources to support your livelihoods and more water and healthier air and, more. So all those things are interrelated, but if the community is not involved in the conservation itself, we're missing a huge foundational piece of what I think, conservation really needs to make it successful around the entire world, right? So, in terms of numbers, our projects aren't that many, but we're a very small organization, and there's no reason every community in the world should have opportunities to conserve their biodiversity, right? Just like they have schools and health posts, and you can become involved in all those different sectors. Biodiversity and the environment should be another sector where we need institutions in every community, right, to support that, I think.
Yeah, beautiful. I know it's important to get into communities and sort of form a bridge to the knowledge that can better enable their response. But I think it's also very important to acknowledge that if we consider the historical component that the survival of these communities was dependent on their appreciation of their biodiversity was dependent on their capacity to manage that biodiversity. And I think what has happened is a disruption in the transfer of knowledge. And I think for me, one of the best strategies is to sort of repair the links. So could you tell me some of the actual strategies that you have taken into communities?
Yeah, so I think because we focus on biodiversity and we tend to work primarily in biodiversity hotspots, we work with communities who already have very valuable wildlife around them, right? Yeah. So often we are working more with wildlife than plants, for example, right? So we're talking areas where there's elephants and tigers and rhinos and pangolin and very endangered species. And so communities are often seeing their forests getting degraded, or even if they have management control over their forests or surrounding habitats, they see the number of the species declining, right? Because they don't have the capacity. So that's usually for us, there's usually within a community, communities are heterogeneous, right? So whenever we say community, we're not saying that everyone in a community wants to do conservation, right? Or cares about biodiversity. So I mentioned other sectors, right? Like some people really care about health. Some people care about education. So it's finding those champions in a community or the people with the interest, right? So on one hand, it's providing them opportunities to express those values or want to learn more about biodiversity for individuals in a community, and then building their capacity and the community's capacity as a whole to, if they don't already have institutions or local groups for biodiversity, help them build those, right? So in most cases, the links to where we're working, the links to the environment are still relatively strong because there are these intact biodiverse areas around the community. So we're very lucky that way, right? It's not an urban situation in most cases. It's an area where those are still intact relationships.
Yeah. Yes, I take your point. In your work, is there one particular experience in terms of the success of your strategy that you would highlight?
So say that again, sorry?
Yeah. Is there, you've worked in so many areas, as I, shared when I read from your bio. So I'm wondering if there's one particular community conservation experience that you could highlight, in terms of a very successful effort that you achieved within that community.
Yeah, so for specific, I can talk generally about just sort of meeting people where they're at in terms of understanding the context of the community, like you mentioned, right? They've got these histories with development projects or with their own biodiversity or understanding their context, of course. But in terms of specific projects, probably our most famous and long-term successful one is the Community Baboon Sanctuary. For the black howler monkey down in Belize, which many people have heard of, and it's a tourism spot also, so many people have visited there. And that was our founder's first project back in the 1980s. And that was actually a project with landowners. So it's very different than most areas where we work because it's with private landowners. Most areas where we work, it's some form of community tenure, right? Doing community forestry or a community concession. And that has been successful, and it's gone through some permutations over time because it's such a long project, but they remain strong. They've gone from male landholder management to a female committee that manages it about halfway through. They switched in the early 2000s. So that has a very interesting history, but because it really built on the community's motivations and the community's love of their land and the howler monkey, right? It's managed to survive this long. And of course, it's because of some champions in the community too, who are part of the original movement. There's always the challenge of handing it over to the next generation, which they are doing. And then another very successful project is the Golden Langur program in Assam, India, near the Manas Biosphere Reserve. And that was focused on the Golden Langur, and they started protecting their forests and managing for it, and the numbers of langur went up very, very quickly. And that, to this day, that was started, I think, 20 to 30 years ago. I have not yet visited that site. I work so much in Nepal, and I work in India a little bit, but I've never been to this site. So in the fall, I'll be going with a board member to visit that site. So I'm very excited to see how it's progressed and some of its changes. I have visited Belize and sort of learned about the history and the progress.
Yeah.
But those are probably our two most well-known successful sites. And you can look up either of them, and there's lots of articles online about those two projects.
Yeah, it's beautiful. It's very important to measure our work, and I think just being able to see that your metric is showing an improvement over time is even more motivation for you to continue what you're doing. About the Guyana trip, you said you made one visit to Guyana. So tell us a bit about your, what you thought about being in Guyana, and where is Guyana in terms of, Guyana, of course, I know has such a varied topology. So I'm not sure how much you were able to see. So yeah, I'll let you.
Yeah, that was I don't have as much information or stories as you probably want, but that was a USAID trip to look at their forestry and community projects about 20 years ago.
Okay.
So it was quite a long time ago. And we visited some very specific USAID supported projects. And I didn't get to go see some of their most successful sites, right, with community groups that are more in the interior. Unfortunately, we're sort of limited in our time. So I don't have as many good stories there because that was work for USAID looking at developing, their next set of biodiversity projects. But they have had some great successes with their biodiversity over the years, but I haven't been back since then. So
okay. Well, that sounds like you need to have another visit.
Yeah, well, that's the thing about community conservation. So what I would love ultimately is to have, a network of people who think about community conservation like we do, right? To have organizations we've identified in every country that really is committed to looking at it from community values and motivation and building their capacity. So if we had a partner that we could identify or, a collaborative network, that's my ultimate dream for community conservation.
That's something that we'll have to work on.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm also wondering, because it's sometimes, a controversial perspective, but in terms of gender, has that been a challenge for you in terms of the gender component?
Yeah, it is a challenge. And I would say my own research, I've done a lot on gender, and, my own research over the years has been primarily looking at people's perceptions of protected areas and sacred forests and some other, non-protected forests. And I've teased out gender. I've written a lot of papers that both look at it, from a community perspective, but also looking at gender differences. And I think in terms of my research, what I've learned is that it's often a case of we just don't ask women to participate, right? So both in terms of sort of the way the systems work. So women tend to be very positive, but they tend to have, as positive as men in some countries, less positive in some countries. But the main way that they differ from men is they don't have access to the same information in the context that we're talking about, but also in the US, even. If you look at like hunting in the US or wildlife conservation, you give a survey out, the man usually does it. We just think of those things. And then in developing country contexts, you've got the fact that women are often not invited to meetings or can't go to meetings. So they just don't know. Like we have one really nice paper on perceptions of tigers in Nepal, and women they like tiger. They want to conserve them as much as the men, but most of the difference between the attitudes is they just don't know that like tigers are integral to the health of an ecosystem, right? That sort of concept has sort of filtered down to the men in all these villages through all these meetings and Nepal's buffer zones and protected areas, but not to women. So giving women, thinking of them as collaborators on these projects, right? So in the way that this sort of anecdotally, I went into Malaysia with a partner, and we have a project there now. And I went in because she was a master's student who'd been doing a camera trapping project with men. And she said, I want to include the women more in this project. And how do I do that? Like, they're already so busy. And how do I don't want to give them more things to do and burden them. This whole idea. Again, this is why women don't get invited to things, because we think we're burdening them. But if they don't get asked, they can't come, right?
Yeah.
So I said, well, let's just ask them. And we said, hey, would you guys be interested in learning how to do some camera trapping? Can we take a half a day and take you out and just show you how to set up camera traps? And they're like, yes, of course. Why didn't you ask us when you started the project years ago for the wildlife research part of this? And so again, we just have to ask women and then find ways for them to be included that match what time they have and what access they have to go out of their house or to, leave responsibility. And those things are changing in so many contexts. And another thing I found is that you just have to push sometimes to a point that might make you uncomfortable, right? So in Myanmar, where I've been working for 20 some years, when we started a new project about 10 or 15 years ago, I said, look, we have to invite the women. And they're like, no, we can't. They're too busy. They don't normally come. It's just not accepted. And I'm like, I don't care. We're going to invite them. We're going to say they're important to the village leaders, and this is why they're important, and try to get their buy-in, right?
Yeah.
And it worked. It totally worked. The partners, the local partners who were Burmese, but they're like, no, we can't do that. It's not socially acceptable. So sometimes we have this outside knowledge that we can bring in and push a little bit, right? And say, no, it's important, and this is why it's important. And we don't want to burden the women. We're not trying to make things harder for them, but we're trying to include them, right? And find ways to include them, because it's critical. It's just so critical.
Yeah. I mean, I still find it challenging to think of the persistence of such attitudes, because we're all struggling to, survive within what our environment provides for us. And the thought of excluding a segment of the population, for me, I still have difficulty dealing with the fact that that still happens. But if we have to be creative to engage and to be more inclusive. So I'm happy to hear that your strategies are indeed working. Barbados is small. We are the most easterly in the Caribbean archipelago, and unfortunately, in terms of our biodiversity, there's not much in terms of the animal population on island. And I believe that this stems back to the period of slavery, where we lost about 90% of our virgin cover. And of course, that means that you are destroying habitat for species. So there's not much animal biodiversity on the island. And our plant biodiversity is also, or has been under threat. And this is one of the reasons that I decided to form our nonprofit, because I felt it important to have our communities understand how important it is to conserve what we do have. And then we're looking for where the knowledge in terms of the traditional value and significance of our plant biodiversity lies. Invariably, it is going to be the female in the household, and the female who is around 60 plus years. So I highlight that because we know that both genders understand about the importance of sustainability and survival. And it really is not productive to exclude any one component of the population. And so when we are looking for champions, that invariably is where we've been finding our champions, yes, within that segment of the population. Okay.
And I appreciate your point.
Yeah.
So I was just going to say, looking at plants, I wish sometimes we looked more at plants, because as I keep talking about large, charismatic megafauna like tigers, right, we tend to work more on those, which just lend themselves to, again, thinking that, men are the important, part of the community.
Yeah.
And I think thinking more about these other resources, broadening our own minds about all, right, that would help us broaden out who we think our partners should be.
Yeah. And then we hear about the extent of biodiversity loss. And I wondered, from your perspective, is it that we are at a tipping point where if we are not able to reach that critical mass of knowledge, where we have energized our communities to the point where the activity with respect to conservation is where we want to see the quality of growth? Are we at a tipping point in either direction? In that the knowledge base has been growing, and we can see where that growth is going to lead to protection, or really and truly are we at a point where we are going to see massive biodiversity loss?
Well, we definitely are seeing massive biodiversity loss, right? And on the other hand, we've seen in the past handful of years how much attention in the headlines has been going to Indigenous peoples' rights over resources and local communities, and how much that has translated into action on the ground is harder to know, and how much would help us with this whole tipping point. I do take heart from having, again, bringing up a Nepal example. In the 1970s, there's something called the theory of Himalayan degradation, which basically said by 2000, the Himalayas and Nepal in particular would have lost all of its forests, given the deforestation rates. It would have lost all of its all of its tigers, all of its elephants. That would all be gone.
Right.
And, and in 2000, community forestry was well underway, and at this point in time, they've doubled their forest. They've increased all those populations. So it's hard to know in the moment, are we at a tipping point or are we not? And all of us are trying to make sure, even if we're there, that we're still fighting against it, right? So I take heart from that story, because we just have to keep working, because we don't know what the story is, what's going to happen in the next chapter.
That's why I asked the question, because I would imagine, it's in areas where, pardon me, we are seeing that growth. And then there are areas where the situation is at the other end of the spectrum. And then it really is difficult to us to have a global metric as to what is happening. But I think it further highlights the importance of engaging our public, because ultimately they are the ones, they're the ones who have to manage what is around them, and will have that vested interest in doing that. And that's my position. No
government has enough resources to double their forests like they did in Nepal, right? That was communities getting access to manage the forests themselves. So that was key, as is the wildlife, having buffer zone programs around protected areas. So communities, if we're not thinking about them as foundational to biodiversity conservation, we're missing out on what we really need, right, to make it happen across large scales.
Oh my. For me, it is so fundamental.
Is that right? I know. So it's sometimes hard, and it's fundamental, but in a way that we think, communities need to be the conservationists. They're not the beneficiaries. They're not sitting there passively waiting for us to come in with projects that convince them, like I said, or provide benefits. They know the benefits. They need the capacity and the policies to allow them to take control and make decisions at their local scales, and then across large landscapes together.
Right. You said it all. That is exactly. But it has been a pleasure having this short chat with you. I take your note that we need to sort of establish a network across areas, so that we have a better linkage, and also, offer us an opportunity to measure what is happening across these networks. Any parting words you'd like to leave with our listeners?
One last thing, just based on what you just said, is also to point out that I think sometimes people think communities are such a small scale, like how does it scale up? And I just want to point out that the phenomenon we've seen is something we call community, conservation contagion, where one community in an area, we saw this in Assam, we see this in Peru, we've published papers on it, where one community starts to do activities to conserve biodiversity, and the communities around them want to learn. So it doesn't take a lot of top down to make this happen, right? The communities can help each other, and they want to. In Belize, we hear the community baboon sanctuary can't meet the needs of the other local communities who want to learn from them. They have so many people coming to ask, right? So that's how this scales up also, right? Is again, the community level, they'll do it if they have the opportunities.
I think it's just natural. It's a natural flow. We all have similar needs, and in order to have these needs met, we always look for resource information, and where that is valuable, we're going to go there. And it's similar to how the thinking is that trees communicate. All of that information is fueled underground, and we're not observing it. And I think it's kind of similar.
That's a great analogy. I love that.
that communication is happening, and because we're not in their midst, we are not aware of it's happening, but it's something that we can capitalize on.
Yeah, that's great. I love that.
Great. So again, thank you so very much. When I was giving that presentation at the conference, and I saw you in the audience, and you came to me, I said, well, it is so important to actually attend these events because you get such opportunities to meet individuals, and it's very important to form, these conduits. Yeah, I want to thank you again for taking your time, and I look forward to hearing more about your work, linking up with you further, and maybe traveling to Guyana with you.
Yeah, that would be wonderful. Thank you so much for the invitation. And you're right. Sometimes those conferences there's a lot of jewels hiding in there. You just have to find them. So thank you so much for this opportunity. I've enjoyed it.